So I introduced myself already. I'm Dr. Wesley Lyons, fairly new veterinarian here with Bethany and Rensselaer, and I'm going to be talking about the ABCs of Gilt entry. It is not nearly as elementary as it sounds. We're going to cover Acclimation, Biosecurity, and Convalescence. Now, that's my $20 word. So typically the biosecurity will come first, but I'm slightly OCD, and so I can't go out of order of ABC, so we'll start there. Let's think quickly about our ideal gilt, and I've got a list here of what I think an ideal gilt should do when she comes into the herd. But what are some of the things that y'all think the ideal gilt should have, and we'll see how well you match up to my list. Just shout them out. Kurt. When you are ready to bring her into the herd, what should she look like? Okay. Okay. It's pretty good. So obviously we want her to reach sexual maturity early, not overly conditioned, like Kurt said. Exposed and acclimated to the farm bugs, just like Kurt said. Like Dr. Schwartz mentioned, we don't want her bringing any new bugs to the farm. Fully vaccinated prior to breeding, and we want her to obviously maintain structural performance throughout the GDU period and beyond. So here she is, our ideal gilt. We're going to bring her into the herd, and so I'm going to talk about the things we should do before we bring her in. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions in this presentation, and so even if these don't apply to your farm specifically, stay tuned. I hope you'll learn at least something. Those two assumptions are, A, that you receive gilts from an outside source. So if you internally multiply, there's still a couple of things in here that you should hear. The other assumption is that you have an appropriate area to acclimate and isolate these gilts. So today, I don't know if y'all heard or not, but we have Swinecast here with us, and they are actually recording all of our talks. And if you've never heard of the At the Meeting group with the Bob Morrison group, these guys used to go to all of the big swine meetings. They would listen to the presentations. They'd put them on CDs, and then you could listen to them later, even if you weren't at the meeting, or to remind you of what you learned at the meeting. Now they have a new podcast that you can download, Android or iPhone, called Swinecast, and listen to all these. So I've had this topic for a while, gilt development, and like any good millennial, I procrastinated on putting this material together. Well, about 6 weeks ago, they released a 3-part series called Gilt Management, and I thought, oh, that's awesome. I'm not going to have to do any legwork. I'll just listen to these 3 podcasts by these professionals, and they'll tell me exactly what I need to put in my PowerPoint. Unfortunately for me, most of what they talked about was the baby gilt and growing her up. But just a couple of highlights from that series in case you haven't had time to listen to it yet. We learned from Dr. Flowers the birth weight influence on lifetime performance. Bigger gilts at birth have better lifetime performance. It's as simple as that. Nutrition and weight at breeding, we learned from Dr. Patterson that's actually not as important as the age of gilt. We often hear people say, well, these gilts are 200 days old or they're 180 days old. More than anything, it's weight at breeding, and basically as quickly as we can get her to that size, that's what's most important. And then what we learned from Noel Williams at Iowa Select Farms is the frequency and adequacy of early boar stimulation and the importance of getting that first heat cycle in the gilt during the development phase. So just quickly some definitions in case these words are, some of these words are, I had to look up the definition myself. So acclimation, we all know, is just the process of adjusting to your environment. Biosecurity, this should be the most elementary term to all of us at this point. The measures that we take to prevent disease from coming into the farm, or if it is within a farm, keep it from spreading. And then finally, convalescence is basically the period needed to return to health after an illness. This is probably the one from a gilt entry phase that we don't do well enough. So Dr. Schwartz already talked a little bit about acclimation, so he made my job really easy. We can break it down into two phases, exposure and vaccination. And I talk on the phone with Dr. Schwartz probably more than he would like. He checks his voicemails, and at least once a week probably he hears my voice on there asking another question, probably a dumb question, and rolls his eyes at me, but he always calls me back. And so this is a quote that I took directly from the Dr. Schwartz and asking him about acclimation and feedback. And so I really like this quote, and he alluded to it a little bit in his presentation, that exposure and, more importantly, feedback is really the devil we know, the bugs that we know we have, and then some we don't. And so one of my former bosses really loved the bucket model of diseases. And so we've got our major pathogen bucket, and then we've got our other knowns and unknowns. These are the ones that we want to acclimate those pigs to before we bring them onto the farm. So in our major pathogens bucket, we've got all of these guys: PRRS, PED, the other coronaviruses, APP, dysentery, and Mycoplasma pneumoniae. So you'll see the asterisk there for a reason in a second. Then we've got all of our knowns and unknowns that our farm has. So these are all the bugs that you are challenging that gilt with when we do feedback. And because herd statuses vary, these PRRS virus and Mycoplasma pneumoniae may or may not be bugs that you want to acclimate those gilts for. But in general, these are the bugs that we don't want to acclimate for. These are the ones we want to keep out. So the how-tos, thankfully Dr. Schwartz already gave us the full rundown on that. But feedback, like he said, is all about quality, quantity, and timing. So on the quality side, it's all about the devil you know, knowing what's in your feedback that you're giving those gilts. And he also already talked about the handling and the kind of material that you need. Quantity, we talked about having an accurate dose and not diluting that out too far when we're feeding back those gilts to boost that performance. And then timing. Obviously, we want to boost that immunity without hindering performance. And Dr. Schwartz alluded to that as well, that, yeah, we want to boost that immunity, but we don't want to override any that they have, especially when we're trying to get them bred. Other exposure methods, a lot of people will do live animal introduction, either some cull sows, which Dr. Schwartz would probably share with us is not the best idea. She's probably seen all the diseases on the farm and isn't shedding them anymore. Given the opportunity and depending on the farm, some people will bring nursery pigs back in. And then another one that a lot of you, it's kind of a new buzzword that you'll be hearing more about as we work towards mycoplasma stabilization or elimination on your farm, is this intratracheal inoculation. Don't have time to go into that today, but we'll talk about it soon. So when we talk about after exposure, after the feedback, we're going to talk about ounce of prevention is worth a pound to cure. This is where our vaccines come in. So what do we vaccinate the arriving gilt for? Well, we have what I would consider our must-haves. Circovirus. It's been about 20 weeks since she's seen a circovirus vaccine, so it's probably a good idea to boost her that immunity. Parvovirus, erysipelas, and lepto. Luckily, I've got a question mark by that one. I don't know of anybody that's currently fighting lepto on their farm, but good thing for us is it's already lumped into the vaccine that we all use. Mycoplasma pneumoniae. If you are not a gilt multiplier producing negative gilts, you better be boostering for it. And Lawsonia is ileitis. Not one that I would have put on here a few years ago until hearing some horror stories from some of my colleagues about not doing it and then getting ileitis breaks during gestating gilt phase. So obviously not fun. Depending on herd status, we'll do some PRRS vaccinations and influenza as well. So biosecurity, I thought it was kind of funny that Dr. Schwartz was talking about blocking and tackling. I don't mention it exactly, but we'll get to that in just a second. But basically, we want to start with bioexclusion. That's keeping the bad bugs out. So that's knowing your source of gilts and then double checking your source. Always have your veterinarian contact the veterinarian representing the supplier of the gilts to talk about the herd status. And obviously you want to have confidence in them that they're going to alert you for any health status changes. Double checking your source. This is when it comes time to test those gilts on arrival. So we always test within our clinic for major pathogens after arrival, PRRS and the coronaviruses. One of the questions that we routinely get is, well, what kind of testing do I do? Do I do oral fluids or do I do serology? Well, we do both. And the reason that we do that is for the PRRS virus, ELISAs. But we'll do PCR for all 3 of these bugs, typically on oral fluids, but we'll do some bleeding as well. The other thing is to test again prior to entry for late bloomers. This is our Mycoplasma pneumoniae. That gilt, if she gets infected prior to coming to your herd, it can take her several weeks for that to show up positive on a blood test. And so this is one that we would test right before we bring them in. So internal biosecurity, I know that all of you are just as excited about the start of Tennessee football season in a couple of weeks. It is upon us. And so internal biosecurity is all about protecting this house. This is beautiful Neyland Stadium if you've never been there. So basically, when we talk about internal biosecurity, all these gilts should be treated as foreign animals until they clear those health tests that we just mentioned. And obviously, until that happens, and even after that happens, we want to follow best biosecurity practices, showering in and out, choring those gilts at the end of the day, and then most importantly, educating and re-educating our farm staff. That's where some of that, we tend to lose it over time, our heightened sense of biosecurity. So finally, we'll talk about convalescence, and I break that down into natural and interventional. So just a reminder of all of our buckets, our major pathogens, and our knowns and unknowns that we want to acclimate those gilts for. Just to kind of put those on a timeline, I'm not making any, well, here's the disclaimer. I didn't put days on all of these because I didn't want to have to go look them all up. But starting basically with the timeline of shedding, so this is natural immunity only. When an animal gets infected, how long are these things going to shed? Dr. Schwartz, close your eyes because hopefully you don't disagree too bad on these. So on the far left of our timeline, we've got influenza with one of the shorter shedding times. Somewhere in the middle, we've got PRRS, and obviously that's dependent on vaccination, somewhere around 60 days. And then on the far end, we've got Mycoplasma pneumoniae, which we know can shed out to 256 days. Again, no time frames on these, but just kind of where some of the other bugs fall on the spectrum, either between flu and PRRS or between PRRS and Mycoplasma pneumoniae. So if you look at this, this can look pretty daunting. Am I going to have these gilts in isolation for 256 days? Well, no. This is natural convalescence. This is how long it would take them to respond naturally. So what we're going to do is have some interventional convalescence, which is what we do with our booster vaccinations and our cool-down antibiotics. So this is a good University of Tennessee athlete here representing the USA in the Olympics, Justin Gatlin. Just won a silver medal the other night against the fastest man in the world. So I think he did pretty well. So that he's cooling down. That was my illustration there. So obviously with those cool-down antibiotics, we want them to be broad spectrum, and our goal is to decrease shedding prior to herd entry. So this is going to take our timeline from 256 days to somewhere considerably shorter than that. So that's a lot of information, and I know you're thinking, okay, so how long do I have to keep these in there? How long is this going to take for me to be able to enter these gilts into the herd? This is going to be a really busy slide, and I know some of you in the back won't be able to see it, so bear with me. So this is just a key summary of events. So we've got our gilt arrival. That's our day 0. We're starting the clock. Once we have them in there 24 to 48 hours post-arrival, we're going to do our testing, where we're testing for PRRS and the coronaviruses. We'll also monitor daily for clinical signs, and obviously let your vet know if you've got gilts in isolation that are not doing well. After we get our negative test results, that depends on what lab you send them to. We send them to Dr. Schwartz. We can have those in 48 hours typically. So roughly 3 to 5 days after arrival and that negative test, that's when we really should start the acclimation phase. We know they're negative for the major pathogens. Start acclimating them early so we can decrease that shedding timeline. So that's when we start our feedback, our vaccinations, and just a reminder of what those vaccinations are. 4 weeks post that initial acclimation phase, we'll start our cool down. We'll booster any of these vaccines, the PRRS if we're doing PRRS, the parvoleptoary, and run water or feed medication to bring that level of shedding down. 2 weeks post cool down, so if you add all these days up, that's about 7 weeks total. That's when we'll do one more testing for mycoplasma if we're entering them into a negative herd. And that's, if they get a negative test there, that's when we can enter them. So if you, we have several herds that utilize this model. It ends up being, like I said, about 7 weeks of quarantine, isolation, and acclimation prior to entering them into the herd. That gives you 1 week to move them in, clean, disinfect, and dry before you bring the next gilts in. So just a summary of events: begin with healthy pigs, prove the health status of the supplier with testing, acclimate with the right material at the right time, vaccinate for the diseases that your herd has, build in that cool down convalescence period with antibiotics and booster vaccinations. Again, this is the area where we tend to get too quick and move those gilts in while they're still shedding and still sick. And most importantly, walk, don't run. It's all about timing and getting that convalescence period in there.